Hi everyone. So this week marks 20 years since the invasion of Iraq by Western forces. So I figured it would be remiss of me not to say something about this. It's got relatively scant attention this 20th anniversary. I'm sure I didn't watch the news earlier. I'm sure it had some headline coverage, but just generally in Yahoo News and so on, I've seen relatively little coverage. And the world, a lot's happened in the world since then. In terms of conflict, all the focus today, of course, is on Ukraine. The arrest warrant for Putin yesterday. Um, and there's a lot of other things going on. A lot of things happen in 2 decades. But it is time, no doubt, there will be reflections on what's happened in Iraq since then. And I think the prevailing view is that it was a foreign policy disaster. Um, Now, just for the record, at the time, I was 17 years old. I was quite idealistic, probably a bit more left wing at that time. I was never radical left, never. But I was quite idealistic and I had it in my mind, student rebelling against government, and it was, um, and I may as well say it with some degree youthful naivety. I thought I knew more than I did. But in retrospect, I don't think it was wrong in protesting the war. I think history has vindicated those of us who thought it was a mistake at the time. Um, my own views on Tony Blair have become more, let's say, complex. At the time, I probably had very strong views against Blair, but in that time, I consider him a leading statesman whose record um, there's a big shadow over his record because of Iraq. But take away Iraq, I would honestly call Tony Blair the greatest post-war prime minister, or one of them anyway. And I think from that point of view, I think it's a real. I don't want to say tragedy. It's not tragic in the sense of people losing their lives, but tragic in the sense of political legacy. I think Tony Blair's reputation would be much higher if it hadn't been for that, because he did have some significant achievements. But anyway, 20 years on, it's become popular to say it was a foreign policy disaster. I think there were several areas. Firstly, it was, whatever way we look at it, an invasion. We invaded a sovereign nation. There's no way around it. By we, I mean the United States and the United Kingdom and allies. It did actually cause some political periods at the time. Jose Maria Aznar, the Spanish Prime Minister, lost his job. And although Bush and Blair faced serious domestic opposition, particularly Blair, a million people marched on the streets of London in February 2003, there was an even bigger rally in Rome. They still rank as the largest anti-war rallies ever, I believe, even surpassing the anti-Vietnam War rallies. That's another thing at that time. I was subconsciously thinking of Vietnam, and I think I deluded myself. I was some sort of hippie or something. I don't know. It was a time of sort of where idealism, this is speaking personally, took over sort of some of the debate side of it, I think. But I did think even at 17, this will cause chaos in the region. We're invading a sovereign country, it's going to cause chaos. The WMDs, which were used as a pretext for the war, this is a very important point, were never found. And I remember when Colin Powell passed away 2 years ago, this issue was brought up, as it was with Donald Rumsfeld and all those senior members of the Bush cabinet. The whole premise of the war was these WMDs, and they were not found. Whether they were discarded, whether they didn't exist in the first place, whatever the case, that was the premise for the war, even well above the human rights issue. Um, So I think that part of it was Blair wanting to basically flatter the Americans and really being it's there's a lot of debate over the Bush-Blair relationship and who was leading who. Obviously Bush was the more powerful leader in the sense he led the more powerful country, but I think certainly the help he got from Blair was a help. Um, but there was a failure in post-war planning. This idea that democracy nation building could just happen I don't think either leader thought that it would happen overnight, but I think they thought, at some point the Iraqis themselves are sort of organize themselves and it will all work out. I think what was hugely underestimated is the sectarian quagmire that followed, and it did. And of course, Iraq became a bloody mess. Thousands and thousands killed. We'll never know the true figure. Um, so it became a mess. And although it's not quite as bad today as it was 10 or even 5 years ago, Iraq is still far from a stable country. A fresh conflict could probably break out at any time. So it's hard to see much good in that. Then you look at Saddam Hussein, and unless you're George Galloway, who shamefully, praised Saddam, and to this day denies it, the fact of the matter is Saddam was a genocidal dictator. He'd already invaded Kuwait, and he was responsible for a genocide, the Al Anfal campaign against the Kurds in the north. And I don't think that anyone can reasonably say that the removal of Saddam in of itself was necessarily a bad thing. Now, there will be some who say that many Iraqis would prefer Saddam to be back in power. That may be true. It may be that those people genuinely believe that because they've seen the chaos that has erupted in their country. I think that would be wishful thinking. I think it's more that they naturally, when your country's invaded, you naturally rally in a patriotic way. But I don't think any Iraqi would seriously, if really push came to it, do you want to live under Saddam again? I think no, I'd find it hard to believe they would genuinely want to live under such a savage dictator, and he was one of the worst dictators in modern times. Um, really, some ghastly torture and brutality happened under his regime. Um, but I've just read a comment. I think it's from an Iraqi woman, and she said, "No, we wouldn't want Saddam back. But what should have happened is the Iraqis themselves should have been allowed to do this organically, i.e., remove Saddam organically." And this is an interesting point because there's this idea that had the West not intervened in 2003, Iraq would somehow be stable or um, peaceful. I think that's very short-sighted. And I think we could say that because of what happened since. There's no question, let me be clear about this, there's absolutely no question that the invasion in 2003 caused chaos in the region. I don't think anyone can deny that. And another problem with the invasion, another big problem, was it seriously, seriously damaged the reputation of both the United States and the UK. Also, Bush absurdly linked in with 9/11 and the war on terror. That was a big mistake. Um, I think when it comes to Afghanistan, there was a lot more justification for intervention there because it had far more of a direct link. So people who just lump all these conflicts together, I think, are wrong. And it's become a common trajectory of anti-West ideologues just to say, oh, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, they're all the same. No, they're not. They're really not. Um, but anyway, let's look at the events since then. The Arab Spring, of course, was a pivotal region-shaping event, 2011, 2010, 2011. Look what happened in Syria. You had a popular uprising against unemployment, against human rights abuses, against rising fuel prices and other issues. And what happened? Not Saddam, Assad crushed it with brutal force. That's how that war began. Despite Russian lies, the war didn't begin in 2013 because that's kind of become the trajectory that this is a case of an embattled leader trying to put down terrorist groups to preserve his country. And, the terrorists are funded by the West. That is a grotesque oversimplification of the reality. Assad's largely responsible for the war in Syria because of the brutality of his regime. Naturally, the Syrians had enough of it. And among the many Russian lies about Syria is that all Syrians who oppose Assad must therefore be pro ISIS. That's grotesque. I've known Syrians who are just ordinary men and women who hate Assad and hate ISIS. So this oversimplification that it's one or the other, it may have become that way, but you know, it, I think it's a distortion of history, in fact, to say that the West started the war in Syria because they funded ISIS. That is grotesquely oversimplistic and not accurate. The war in Syria began because of Assad's brutality. So if we look at the countries that followed like dominoes, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Syria, Yemen, it's very plausible there would have been an uprising in Iraq against Saddam at that time. I think that is very, very plausible. Almost certain, in fact. So what's to say that Saddam wouldn't have responded the same way as Assad? He almost certainly would have, with brutal force, crushed the protests, as happened actually after the first Gulf War. Um, and Iraq would just be like Syria today. In other words, some sort of conflict would have been inevitable in Iraq. I believe that now. I think that regardless of whether the West invaded or not, I think Iraq would have ended up in some sort of armed conflict. Um, as it so happened, the Western intervention muddied the waters because it, well, in so many ways. And it also meant that regardless of removing a tyrant, we invaded a sovereign country. There's no getting away from that. But it's not the same as Ukraine. Why? Yeah, both situations are invasions, but the big, big difference, and it's very important, is that in the case of Ukraine, Russia questions the very existence of Ukraine as a sovereign state. Russia has forcibly deported thousands of people into Russia. In the case of Iraq, you had so-called nation building. It was a complete failure. Um, but Britain and America never questioned Iraq's existence as a nation state. You know, they called it intervention, and it was a foreign policy disaster. There's no getting away from that. Tony Blair has even come close to admitting that. He'll never use those words, of course, but he has somewhat changed his stance from being, totally defensive to acknowledging that mistakes were somewhat made. The truth is, it will forever sully the reputations of George W. Bush and Tony Blair and the other leaders that were involved in that. Um, but I put it to people who say the West should just stay out of the Middle East completely, like never get involved. Believe me, it is tempting. I think a lot of Western policymakers would say, "To hell with it. We are condemned no matter what we do." This is just the point. Look at Libya. When Gaddafi started killing his own people, they were pleased for Western intervention. When Sarkozy and Cameron went to Benghazi, they were cheered. So anyone who wants to oversimplify the Middle East and say, "Oh, everything would be fine if the West stayed out," that is so misguided. I've just seen a comment where a guy was arguing that, well, it's all the fault of the West because they've been propping up these dictators for years. Yeah, the West has propped up dictators like Mubarak in Egypt and others. Um, Something David Cameron acknowledged, but then the argument be, well, wait a second, if the West is responsible for these dictators, then is there not an argument to be made that the West should remove them or help that? Um, I definitely think the fallout from Iraq was no Western leader will, or the idea of any ground invasion, they would think very, very carefully given the fallout from the Iraq War in 2003. Um, we had thousands of civilian deaths, millions of people probably displaced, 179 British servicemen killed, thousands of American servicemen killed, and many others. It was a mess. It's not that, I mean, in any conflict, you're going to get military losses. I'm not saying that's avoidable, but certainly a lot of the grieving families of those soldiers would justifiably ask, was it worth it? And I know that they will never forgive Tony Blair. Um, so I do think it was a foreign policy mistake, a very big one. But I would say that anyone who says that without invasion Iraq would somehow be peaceful, I think that's extremely naive, given the events that have happened in Syria. So that's my reflections 20 years on. I think it was a foreign policy mistake, a very big one. I think that people far too often, and this comes from the left, but also comes from people with an anti-West worldview, um, far too often, the Middle East is overly simplified. That if the West just stayed out, then everything would be fine. I think that is nonsense. Iraqis themselves are responsible for the destiny of their country, and they have to decide: do they want to go down a sectarian path where they hate each other on religious grounds, or do they want a better future? Saying let's blame everything on 2003 ignores the fact that Iraq had problems before 2003. It may not have been in a state of war, But it kind of disgusts me actually when left-wing people, and it is predominantly the left, and other anti-West people make out this notion that Iraq was. I remember in Michael Moore's film, it wasn't Bowling for Columbine, it was Fahrenheit 9/11. He had this segment where it sort of showed pre-war Iraq, and he tried to make it look like it was some sort of utopia, children playing on swings, and it was all nice. Yeah, Michael Moore, just leave out all the torture and human rights abuses. And I must admit, I was a fan of Moore at the time, not anymore. I think it's typical of left-wing distortion, vilify the West and just distort what was actually the situation on the ground. Um, Adam McKay done this in his film Vice. That's one reason I downgraded that film. It was a weird film anyway. It kept being close up to his heart operation for some reason. But again, Adam McKay had this absurd conclusion that Dick Cheney is responsible for the war in Syria. That's a grotesque oversimplification of the events in the Middle East. And anyone who wants to make the Middle East out to be black and white, it's possibly the most complex region on earth. Um, and there are no simple solutions for any of its problems. If the West never intervened, the criticism would be that we don't care. If we do intervene, we're warmongers only looking for oil. So this is shaking up a bit. So yeah, that's my reflections 20 years on. The lesson is that, we should not invade a country and expect that democracy will just happen there because it will immediately make us the villains and it will, without any significant planning or even if there is planning, without considering the sectarian divisions, um, destined to failure. Probably what should have happened was the West should have supported Iraqi opposition in some form. I'm not necessarily talking weapons, I'm talking um, speeches, moral support, economically even, and allowed the Iraqi opposition to overthrow Saddam themselves. Um, I'm not saying that would have been simple, but in retrospect, maybe it would have been the preferable course. Okay, thanks for watching.